As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
Okay, hey everyone. We are doing an interview with my friend Ed. Ed is a data scientist. He writes for Towards Data Science, and he teaches data science in Python bootcamp. So through that data science bootcamp at UT, that's actually how we met. We taught the data science bootcamp together. He was the instructor. I was a TA. And currently now we're working on data science articles together. So Ed, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. So, Ed, we made this machine learning model to predict NFL games. It's kind of something we've been talking about doing for a bit, just never really got around to it until this season.
Yeah, this has been a long time coming. I think we played around with this a little bit years ago at this point. It's been quite a bit, hasn't it? But I think this is the first time we've actually finished. So we have a model that is giving us predictions for each team's scores in each of the upcoming games.
Yeah, super excited for this. I hope it is useful, and I think it will be. So, to start off, for anyone who is unfamiliar, Ed, can you quickly give a definition of machine learning?
No,
Can you try?
I can try. So machine learning is a bunch of different techniques. And the thing that they all have in common is that they learn from data, that they're derived from data, and there's not a lot of human intervention in them. So basically, you choose the model, there's a lot of different choices, and you choose certain parameters or and some things called hyperparameters, which are basically settings on models. But once you choose the style of model, what pre-processing you want for your data, any of that stuff, you kind of let the model do its thing. And that's basically what machine learning is, which differentiates it from other approaches to either software engineering or analytics or statistics.
Gotcha. So, focusing on the differences yet again. So, between machine learning and maybe traditional stats, where someone's just making models on their own, how does it kind of differ?
Well, so they overlap, and a lot of the time you can use the same techniques for both statistics and machine learning. But generally, statistics is more focused on showing things are true from samples about population. So, the sort of classical problem, think about a drug and a control group. You have an experimental setting. Now, your goal is not just to show that the drug group did better than the control group, that the treatment group was better than the control group. You want to show that it's done well enough better that it couldn't just be by random chance of how the control and the treatment group were drawn. So that's sort of your sort of classic answers to statistics. But in general, that's an experimental setting, and a lot of data isn't really derived from experimental settings. It's generated by real world business processes or government related things. Data is tracked for some political reasons, and we want to see policy effects and things like that. And that in that case, we need to use a sort of different set of models, sometimes now more recently called statistical learning models, but generally in the past probably just referred to as regression models. And basically what these do is they learn how a number of inputs affect an output. But from a stats point of view, your goal is to try to determine the effect sizes. That's usually what you're studying. You're studying, for example, controlling for a bunch of other variables. Does this policy, so for example, minimum wage is instituted in one county and another county right next to it for some reason doesn't have one, maybe because it's across state lines. So you have a difference there. But then you have all kinds of other stuff, right? Maybe one county is slightly wealthier, maybe one is poorer, etc. But what you're interested in then is asking, does the feature of being in the county that has the minimum wage, does that one have a statistically significant effect? Does it look like that's actually potentially causal? In machine learning, you could actually use the same model. And actually, we do use a linear regression model. We tried a few other ones, but linear regression did the best for our problem. And basically, what you do is that instead of being concerned about the importances, the treatment effects on your variables, you're just sort of concerned overall, does this make a good prediction? And so, generally speaking, the difference between statistical modeling and machine learning is whether you're primarily focused on learning the effect sizes, or whether you care more about predictive accuracy. So, machine learning more naturally deals with the prediction part.
And so, other than machine learning kind of being a buzzword that everyone's kind of interested in nowadays, what can it actually do better than an everyday sports bettor when making bets?
So, in general, there's two types of machine learning. And again, this is a fairly broad split, but we have unsupervised learning and supervised learning. And what we're going to be focusing on here is supervised learning, because that's the type that's used to make predictions. And basically, what the problem ends up being is we want to find a model that's really good at, through a number of different ways. There's a lot of possibilities of how we can set this up. But basically, we want to find something that will learn from the data how to map a certain set of particular observations inputs to their output, and do this in such a way that works well across all the outputs. Basically, they're trying to learn a function that maps inputs into outputs. So in the case of our model, we had a number of features, but one of them was yards. We also looked at turnovers. We looked at, and we'll talk more about some other things, but we had an indicator of whether the game happened during prime time. We also had an indicator of whether it was a home game or not. Basically, what the model does then is it learns how these, in the presence of everything else, in the presence of all the other features, how changing these features would increase or decrease the score of the game. So that's what supervised learning is. Now, you could come up, there's an alternative way to do this. You could do this with heuristics, which is just basically a fancy way of saying you make up the rules and you try to make good rules. So, you might have, well, I don't know, Dylan, what would you have? What would be a heuristic rule? What's a rule you could think of that would highly indicate somebody winning a game?
Oh man, I think last year's win total or Super Bowl winner is kind of one that a lot of people look to. So Tampa Bay won last year. People might think they'll go undefeated this year just simply because they won the big game last year.
Yeah, so that right, that's a very simple heuristic. And sure, you sort of know this information from the past, and you can apply it. Now, you could have much more complicated ones. You could basically take a feature and split if it's above this value. So, if a team had 10 turnovers, they're going to lose, right? That might be a reasonable rule. The thing is, though, there's not that many games this rule would apply to. So when you go lower, you might question, is 2 turnovers enough? When does it start mattering? And you could pick these rules and you could use some knowledge, but then you'd have to still kind of go in and tweak these rules and arrange them and stick all the rules together. And this is really one of the advantages of machine learning, is that there are machine learning models that can basically make up these optimal rules to find them from the data. The decision trees, for example, actually work very much like this. We use linear regression, which isn't looking for rules quite like this, but it's looking for sort of general effects. If we increase the number of opponents' turnover by 1, we see an increase of, and I'll actually talk about this later, but we see an increase of some fixed amount. If I recall, it was something around like 2 points on average per turnover. Although I'm probably misremembering that. We'll have a look when I actually look at the numbers. That might have been a standard deviation increase in that causes 2 points. But anyway, we'll have a look in a bit. So That's one thing. The machine learning models sort of optimally weight either the rules or the global effects. Sure, you might be able to say, and you should probably check the model afterwards, if the number of yards is showing a negative effect on the target, something's probably gone wrong. If the number of times the opponent has given the ball to the team under consideration has the wrong sign, if that says your score goes down, that's clearly wrong. So we're going to look, right? We're going to see if these effects have gone the right direction or not. But the thing is, it's hard for us to just sort of guess at those numbers. We really need the data then to sort of find these numbers for us. And that's precisely what linear regression does. It's estimating these numbers for us, and we can look into it. And sort of going back to one of the other questions, the stats versus machine learning, we are sort of using the stats parts of linear regression in order to kind of validate that our linear regression model is working in the correct way. But in any case, right, one of the advantages of machine learning versus just coming out with heuristics is that machine learning will allow you to optimally weight these heuristics or weight the rules that it creates based on features. There won't be any indeterminacy. And it does it in such a way that's optimal. Different models, there's different meanings to the word optimal there, but it doesn't, in general, they're trying to optimize some goal of basically having predictions that are on the train set very close to the reality for the train set. And that's how they work. They try to do that. And so another advantage of using machine learning, and maybe even a bigger one, is that you can be very careful about what your model has seen, basically about what it knows. And this is really important as opposed to the heuristics, because when you make up heuristics, you often have last season in mind. But what you really like to do to validate a model, 2021 hasn't happened yet. 2020 has. But if we base our heuristics off 2020, there's a good chance it's going to do well on 2020. For example, who won the Super Bowl in 2020? If that's one of our heuristics, well, we get that game right because it's already happened. What we really want is we want to be able to get the games right before it happened, and we want to have some idea of how well our model will do. And we can get this with machine learning. I think it would be very hard. You'd have to stick somebody in a cave, maybe make them watch up to 2019, but not watch 2020. And then, sure, maybe they could come up with a set of heuristics, and you could validate those on 2020. But in general, it's really hard to get this knowledge filtration in the right way so that you're not contaminating the results with what you already know has happened. Where with a model, it's very easy. You just only show the model the data that it should know, that it should be able to learn from, and you don't show it, for example, 2020. So we built the model with the goal in the end of figuring out 2021. We want to use it for betting this season. But in order to know that it does well, we sort of simulated this. We said, okay, well, let's pretend the model doesn't know anything about 2020. And let's go and train it on 2015 through 2019 and see how it does on 2020. We're able to enforce that it's not able to know things that it shouldn't know. So this, I think, is maybe even the bigger advantage of just using heuristics. It's not biased. It doesn't have that human bias or that human hopefulness. So that's one big part.
Yeah, and definitely that human bias is always an issue for any sports bettors, especially newcomers and novices, where they're like, oh, I like this team. I think they will win, but don't actually back it up by any data. The model is the exact opposite of that. It's only data. It has no feelings about a team one way or another. And so given that, it kind of sounds like, is that a downside, Ed? Do you think that it's a downside that our model will not know, let's say a star player gets injured for a team. A human would know that right away and maybe adjust their betting strategy accordingly, but our model will not know that and will still make predictions. Is that a problem?
Yeah, so it sort of sounds like a problem, but I'd point out something. Just knowing the star player got injured, does that really help you predict the score of the game? Sure, it might make you think that it ought to be lower, but what if you're wrong? What if you decrease the score too much? Right? You don't know how to decrease the score the right amount. So, in some sense, by adding the bias, you're able to attempt to solve the problem, but by not knowing what you can't possibly know, the actual effect size of that player being injured, you're not going to get a good result guessing about this. So in general, our model has done a few things, or rather the way we thought about it, even before we got to the modeling stage, is just how we think about our data. We chose a few things intentionally. So one thing we chose is that when we're predicting a year, 20x, we're only using data up through 20x minus 1. So basically, if we're trying to predict the 2020 games, we're going to feed the 2020 stats of each team into the model in order for us to get a prediction for that game, for each team's score. So basically, we represent the teams by metrics of how good they did, not by their names. So there's two important things going on here. One thing is that we don't actually label teams. Our model doesn't actually know anything about the names of teams. Yep. It does, however, know their stats from last season. So information about the teams is captured by that. Another important thing is it doesn't know anything that's happened this season. And let me talk about another way that this sort of can be an advantage, actually. The issue about knowing information from the same season is that there's never been a typical season. There's never been games where no one has been injured. So hopefully maybe from the other features, the model has gotten some of this information. So for example, we have a weeks feature, basically saying what week it is, and that one has found to have some effect. So later games we found to be higher scoring than earlier games. Dylan, do you have any theory on that?
Yeah, I do. So as we know, the weeks go up. Every week it increases by 1 week. So as that number kind of gets higher, we're later and deeper into the season. And like you said, injuries are going to happen. They happen every single year. It would be great if they didn't, maybe a little less exciting, but they happen every year. And as the weeks go forward, teams get banged up more and more. And I think, honestly, the bigger thing is towards the end of the season, multiple teams might know where they stand in terms of playoff seeding. And when they know exactly where they're going to be, they're not playing their star players anymore. They're not playing their starters at all. These are all the backups. So the players that got you these points in the past for the season, they're not playing anymore. And so that's why I kind of think we can see an impact using that week feature.
Yeah. So let me add another thing to my answer in general, which is, humans, especially when they're looking inside a particular season, the one that's going on right now, there's some tendency to sort of buy into things like momentum. If a team wins something, then they'll win the next game. We don't know if this is true. These are professionals. I really doubt that they're as impacted by this as people think. But this is also something testable. Dylan, maybe we should try testing this later. That could be an interesting side project with our data.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting there, Ed. Sorry to cut you off. But yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to kind of look into because these are professional players. This isn't a high school movie. It's not Remember the Titans where they're like, oh, wow, we went winless for half the season. Now we win one game. We're going to win the rest of the season. It doesn't work that way in real life.
And, bettors have the same sort of bias. They're like, oh, well, I made the past 3 picks right, even though this one looks risky. I know my luck. Or, oh, I've lost the rest of them. I'm going to win this one for sure, right? And models are not biased by that.
And sadly, that's an issue I've seen while going to Vegas. People will look at that roulette table. Oh, it's been red 10 times in a row. The next one has to be black. Doesn't work that way.
Nope. Yeah, people always think about balancing out the odds, but that doesn't actually work that way. Even in roulette, sure, on average, there's roughly a 50-50 chance of red or black. there's a little less than
Hmm.
that because of the dealer's advantage. But just because you got 5 blacks in a row, that in no way tells you anything about whether the next one will be red or black. The odds don't balance themselves out.
Yeah, exactly. And going more into how we think about this problem, I personally think, as we talked about it, we have two different sides of how we're viewing this, right? I definitely have more football knowledge than you do, admittedly, and you haven't really paid a lot of attention to the NFL until
That's right.
now. um,
Yes.
so I think that gives us a unique perspective on this problem and maybe made us construct it in a different way. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it might have. So, and I think this sort of teamwork works really well, in model building too, as well as in scientific settings or business settings, is that one person really understands the problem well, but then the other person has expertise in modeling and sort of designing the experiments to sort of validate and make sure everything's okay. So, working with Dylan on this has been very useful for this. And, you know, we've talked a lot about gamblers and bettors who don't know anything about machine learning or stats making stupid decisions, but we should probably talk about the opposite as well, which is that people who know a lot about stats and know nothing about football make these sort of useless models. I think one very common one we've seen, that we've had students do projects on this, where basically they try to predict whether a team will lose or win based on the information of the game they just played. And this is useless for two reasons. One reason that it's useless is you're using outcomes of the game to predict other outcomes. So you couldn't possibly use this in any way for betting or prediction. And then the other reason that this is useless is that, well, it's basically the same thing viewed from another way, but these aren't like causal. The number of yards you make in a game, sure, it's like mathematically related to how you win the game, but you don't really gain any information about what's important or what's not even from these sorts of models. So, you can easily make the other mistake. And since we've picked a relatively simple model, and honestly, I think one of the best things we did is how we chose to just construct the data, where basically we flip flopped each row where we had team one and team two swapped. So when we're making predictions for team two, we put it in the team one slot. When we're making predictions for team one, we leave it in the team one slot. So that allows us to predict two different scores from the same row, but for the different teams. And that also means that when we train everything, we can do the same swap as well. Now, this comes from me thinking about the problem, but also from Dylan's expertise in football. Another point where it's been important to have an expert, somebody who knows football well, is the type of models I'm interested in looking at in this, partially because we have a small data set, but partially because we don't really want to bet on models that we can't understand how they work. So it's been useful is basically Dylan can help give us ideas of how to create features based on knowing hypotheses of how things work. So, for example, two of these that I probably wouldn't have thought of is whether it's a home game. I may or may not have thought about this one, but I certainly wouldn't have thought about whether it's prime time or not. So that information is useful. I probably wouldn't have thrown the week in. It wouldn't have been obvious to me that there would be an effect from the week either. So, getting this information from Dylan allows us to sort of choose better features and construct better features for our models.
Yeah, and for as far as the home team and primetime things go, I wasn't really sure if they were statistically significant. It's something you always hear just as a football fan or a sports bettor, home team advantage, right? That's what they always say. And, maybe sometimes that's true. Maybe sometimes it isn't. It might depend on the team, but like we said, our model is not team specific. So we weren't really caring about that. We didn't say, oh, this is a Kansas City home game, as if it would be different from a Las Vegas Raiders home game. I think maybe that might have had a little bit more impact, but the prime
Yeah, it might have if we looked at the team level. Yeah, you're right. And another thing, we actually have the coefficient for the effect size, and we found both of those do have a positive effect, but they're relatively small. And since we've been focused on prediction, we've tried running the model without them, and it didn't help. But that doesn't necessarily give a lot of indication of whether we'd find it statistically or significant or not. So we should look into that. That would be, just as a curiosity, it would be interesting to see if those are statistically significant or not.
And even more so maybe with the primetime games. The
Yeah.
primetime, for anyone who is unfamiliar, it means it's the only game on at that time. So like Thursday night football, Sunday night football, Monday night football. Those are considered the primetime games. Sometimes there's other ones if a game's in England or something like that. But for the most part, it's going to be Thursday, Sunday night, Monday night. And some players do definitely have a change in their game when they're in a primetime game. But overall, and again, our model is ignorant of players and teams. It might overall not have as much of an impact as it would at a team or player level.
Yeah, that's probably true too, right? You could look at player level stuff and you probably would find some players that had this. You'd have to be careful though for reasons of multiple hypothesis testing and actually trying to determine this. But yeah, you might be able to find some effects at a player level.
And you already kind of mentioned it, but we did end up using a linear regression model. We tried a few other models, random forest, Poisson. Um, are we surprised at all that linear regression kind of ended up being the best model?
Well, so in comparing linear regression versus random forests, I'm really not surprised. And the reason for that is random forests are basically what's called an ensemble of decision trees. And more or less how decision trees work is they give you a hierarchy of rules. They basically figure out, think something like heuristics. Of course, they figure it out from the data and they stack these rules. And these are really good when there's local effects. So in other words, if it's true that if the game is in a certain state or the data, if you're having two teams that are similar enough, maybe the effect of more yards is different somehow, then these models capture these sort of local effects very well. But in general, we don't really have features, we don't really think there's anything that only works well in certain circumstances in our data set. In general, we sort of expect to have global effects here. And linear regression is really good at capturing those global effects. So it doesn't matter which two teams are playing, a turnover is probably going to have generally a fixed effect. And more turnovers will probably have, if there's 10 times as many turnovers, that'll probably have 10 times the effect. And that's how linear regression works. That's how it looks sort of for global effects. It doesn't matter, there's no history, there's no memory, there's no local effects basically here. So linear regression is really good when you expect most of the effects to be global, and we certainly do. So I think that's part of the reason we're seeing it perform so well with this sort of data. What I'm honestly a little bit more surprised about is that Poisson regression actually ended up doing slightly worse. There's statistical reasons to think that scores will typically follow a Poisson distribution, and Poisson regression is actually sort of a modification of linear regression. But as it turns out, when we looked at 2019 games, 2019 before 2015 through 2019 to train, and then we looked at the error of how good this is at predicting the 2020 scores. We found linear regression was actually slightly better than Poisson regression.
Yeah, and kind of as we know, Ed, after teaching quite a few of these boot camps, and we have students who will do their projects on kind of predicting scores for games, and it's always a little disappointment we can hear in their voice when they find out that linear regression, maybe the most boring model, ends up being the best. There's always a little disappointment when that ends up being the best model because they want to use something new and fancy,
Fancier.
like a neural network. So why didn't we touch neural networks?
Well, so first let me say something. Linear regression, as far as just the fitting part, is pretty simple. Even going through the math and writing it yourself, that's fairly simple. But linear regression is old, meaning that it's also been very well studied, and it's been studied well in a statistical sense, which means that it's a very well understood model that you can figure out how it works. You can figure out how it estimates certain coefficients, which are the effect sizes. And you can also see if these effect sizes are statistically significant or not. So you do have a lot more interpretability in linear regression than you do with just about any other model. So it's somewhat not surprising. Another thing we've mentioned that, if you have linear global effects, if your data is linear, which was sort of my argument there, right? If you had 10 times the number of turnovers, you probably expect 10 times the effect. That seems intuitive to me, that there's not some diminishing effect of turnovers. If you get the ball, then you get the ball. It doesn't matter how late or early in the game it is, whether or not that helps you score or not, right? So it's just like, it seems like a global effect. And linear regression is great at capturing linear effects. And I think that's largely what we're seeing in the model here. Why didn't we even consider neural networks? Well, we've already gone up in the complexity path by looking at random forests, and we found random forests were worse than linear regression. So given that, more complexity generally makes me think we'll do even worse. I also know we'll do very poorly with neural networks because we have relatively few features and we only have 960 data points in order to build the model that predicts 2020 games. And that's the one we want to validate the model off of. And I just know that that's not enough data to train a neural net.
Yeah, for sure. Now, going back into the model as we progress through the season, we kind of already talked about how we know for a fact throughout the season there's going to be injuries, there's going to be teams that are performing better than expected, there's going to be teams that are performing worse than expected. So you also kind of spoke about keeping someone in the dark, putting them in a cave, and then trying to do these predictions. Do we want to do that with our model, or should we kind of continue to tweak it as we move forward?
So honestly, here's one way to look at it, the in the cave example. If we can basically build a model that can tell, basically based on last year's stats, how good a team is going to do against another team based on the two teams last year's stats, we've learned football in some sense. We've learned how football scores are determined by a number of different variables. So it shouldn't, if we do any tweaking, we should basically tweak the model with updates of that knowledge. So we do intend, I think, to do a few changes here and there, but I want to do the changes in such a way that they're not just sort of reactive because our model was perhaps wrong on one game. That's not necessarily suggesting that our model's bad, right? Models in general are always wrong in some sense. We're never going to guess the score exactly correct. I'd be very surprised if we did.
It's big money
so
if we
given
do.
that, right? No, that's true. But maybe we'll be lucky. But even if we're wrong a small amount at the time, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily suggest that we need to go back to the drawing board just because we have a small error. And it's probably worth bringing this up. I see this a lot in business settings, sort of playing this, especially when heuristics are in play, or if you're trying to merge a machine learning model with a heuristic model, there's this tendency to sort of play whack-a-mole. So what happens is you're like, oh, well, the model got this result wrong. Why don't we tune this in some way on the model? And what happens? Well, it's a seesaw. So now instead of getting one thing wrong, the next time we do it, it gets everything wrong. Because the tweak, the model is sometimes wrong now, but now it's always wrong. Here's probably a good way to imagine it, right? So imagine there's some points here, and then this line is moving. The goal is then to get all the points that are different on different sides of the line. So you can move around the line, you can pivot it, all right? But here's the issue. There's sometimes it's going to be an impossible situation. If there is a red point here, a blue point here, and a red point here, there's literally no way to draw the line that separates them perfectly. So you will never get every single point on the right side of the line. And then the problem is if you tweak your line too much, you're actually screwing it up. And a machine learning model, this will be a classification model in this sense, but it'll already sort of position the line in an optimal way. So by sort of overreacting to one wrong observation, you're actually putting it out of whack even more.
Yeah, it's essentially chasing the dragon, right? You'll never catch that dragon. And machine learning models can be a bit fragile. Like you said, if we're over tweaking over every little misfire we get, we're only making our model worse, and it might just end up crumbling down. And so that might be an issue that previous people have had in the past. So I guess the question a lot of people will ask is, why have others failed at this problem? And why would we be any different? Why can ours perform better as compared to others who may have failed at taking on this task?
That's a good question. So one thing is, I think the fact that we're ignoring team names is actually going to work really well. So models can sort of get some emotion in them if people sort of include variables of, is this my favorite team or not? Or, is this a team that made it to the playoffs last year's or not? Team compositions change from year to year. So again, we're really not trying to learn how well a particular team will do against another team directly. We just want to know in general, if two teams with these stats go and face each other, what will the two scores be? So we're sort of, I think, somewhat immune to that. The other issue, I think, the fact, I think one thing that's going to make this more successful is that we're sort of ignoring things that happen inside the season. And it's because it's easy to overreact if something's gone wrong on one game. And it's hard to tell if something's an overreaction or not. I don't know, right? There's a sort of famous 538 case where they got the election wrong. Was this because their model was bad? Was this because their data was bad? Or was this actually fine, but the models are wrong sometimes? Was it actually a 2% chance Trump was going to win, and it just happened to give us that too? It could be. It's hard to tell. We really don't know the answer to that question, right? And it's the same thing with a game. If our model is wrong about a game, is the model wrong? Or does it just that, the model, it has some uncertainty around it? Did some very rare event occur in this particular game? And honestly, we sort of find it probably more likely that it was sort of a rare event, because we know in general how well our model does. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if it's wrong, it doesn't really tell us much about it going to be wrong the next game or not.
Yeah, and you spoke about it where there's always going to be uncertainty in models. At least there should be. If a model is getting something 100% right, 100% of the time, something's generally wrong, right?
Yeah, generally. So there's two cases. One is the problem you're trying to answer is just too easy. I really doubt that this is the case here. But some problems can just be too easy, especially classification problems. It's not surprising. If you trained a model on a bunch of pictures of dogs and what's something that looks completely unlike a dog, a hot dog. And then you showed it an image of a dog and a hot dog. It's going to be pretty much right. It's going to work. Why? Because it was an easy problem. So again, I don't think we're in the easy problem territory here.
No.
So then when we're not in the easy problem territory, if a model appears to do too well, often we think it's doing something wrong. And in particular, the first culprit is something called data leakage, where in some inadvertent way, we sort of let the model see some information it probably shouldn't have seen, that has sort of tripped it up.
Yeah, no, that's a big reason why I brought that up, Ed, because when we built this model, you sent me the validation results and you were
Mm.
shocked by how well it did.
I was surprised how well it did.
And then I went and actually applied it and did some back testing for some betting data for the 2020 season. And again, we were surprised how well it did. So before we get into the results of the back testing, why is back testing important? Why do we need to do such a thing?
So let me mention something first. When we saw it was doing really well, since it was a simple model, it was fairly easy to go in and see, is there data leakage? And then it was also sort of easy to go and inspect the model and make sure it wasn't like weighting features in some weird way. And it wasn't. So it looks like, this actually might do very well in the future. Let's talk about back testing though. So there's this issue, and backtesting really comes from people making stock strategies, financial strategies, alphas, if you want to call them that. Basically, strategies where you try to make money by buying, selling stocks, options, whatever. But it's very commonly realized that simply being able to predict whether a stock goes up or down, some information like that, isn't really the right way to test a strategy. And it's because even if you're right most of the time, almost all the time, about a stock going up, if you have a down and the down is very high magnitude, right? If it drops a lot, then you're in trouble. You might actually end up being right most of the time, day to day, of whether the stock will go up or not, and you still lose a lot of money. And that same thing can have with betting. Basically, if a game has a sure bet in some sense, right? You have a sure bet, which means that it costs a lot of money to bet on the favored winner, and the returns are fairly low for that one. There's some chance the model will be wrong, even if it's good in general. I mean, this isn't really even necessarily a fact about the model. Right, the fact that people go and watch games largely has to do probably with the possibility of an upset. It would be pretty boring going to games if you knew who was going to win already. So, this again might have very little. It's not even a fact about the model. It's just sort of games are unpredictable, right? That's sort of the appeal to this. So, you don't you might be wrong betting for the favored for even a heavily favored result, right? Upsets are sort of the whole point. And the idea here though is that sometimes you might not want to take a bet on a favorite. If the bet is really expensive and the upside is low, then maybe you shouldn't take this bet. And when back testing helps with this too, and really there's another element here. You're not just testing the model with back testing, you're testing your strategy as well, hopefully. Now, so we tested sort of the naive strategy, which is that regardless of anything else, we always bet on the team that the model says we should bet on. And even with this, and that makes sense, but right, we have a third option, which is let's just skip this bet. If we don't have strong enough information, let's just skip this bet, right? That's another possibility. But we didn't allow that. We made every bet according to the model. We didn't allow any passes, and in backtesting, we found it did really well. So that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ed, like you said, we did not apply any betting strategy there. We will be applying a betting strategy going forward for this season. Now, we're going to list the results of the model for every pick it makes, but we're also going to have a conversation every week about the model's picks and if we would actually take them. And we're going to, maybe compare the two, see how they pan out. But I do have the results from that back testing we did on 2020. And this is if we took every bet on every single game. So 2020 season, there were 240 games total. And the bets we were using the model for are the over-under, the spread, and the money line. So who's going to win that game? So for the over-under and the spread, we made an assumption of a minus 110 in American odds for these types of bets, because that's kind of a common odds for over unders and spreads. So you'll usually see that minus 110, and our betting unit is going to be $10. So those are the two assumptions we're going to make here for these results. So starting with the over under, we had a win percent of 72.08. So of the 240 games, we were correct on the over under 173 times. And that results in a 40.94% return on an investment. So for the spread, it was even better. Again, we were surprised by these results and made sure to triple, quadruple check everything and make sure we didn't screw up anywhere. So for the spread, the win percentage was 8.83. So 194 out of the 240 games we hit on, resulting in a 58.48% return on investment. And like I said, I didn't go back and get the odds for the money line and everything. So instead of putting a dollar value on this, we instead just look at the win percentage. And for the money line, the model was able to predict the winner 83.75% of the time. So 201 of the 240 games, it predicted the winner correctly.
Nice. Sounds like we have something there. But yeah, there's one sort of caveat to these results is we need to look at the odds. And
Exactly.
that's gonna be a question we're gonna have to decide. And at some point we might actually have a little bit more mathematical sophistication around this. But for now, Dylan is going to, use his knowledge to basically tell us, if the upside appears too low to taking the bet, even with what the model says, maybe we should skip this one.
Exactly.
So that's going to be how we're looking at it.
And that's a strategy we're definitely applying. I never bet on heavy favorites. It is not worth it. The upside isn't there. So many people see it as, oh, it's free money. No, it's not. If it was free money, these bookkeepers would not allow the bet to be made.
Well, if it was free money, right, the bookkeepers would change the odds slightly so that they would still, at least as a risk neutral agent, they would still make money. And that's exactly how they set these.
Yeah, Vegas does not lose even if you win. That's kind of the laws of betting that everyone should know. So we talk about these backtesting results. We talk about our data validation, and both of them outperformed our expectations. So, Ed, how confident can we be in actually using this model this season when making our bets?
So, well, let me tell you some of the numbers. So, I think the most telling number with the simplest interpretation we can talk about at the validation step is the mean absolute error. And this basically tells you, actually literally tells you, the absolute value of the difference of the actual score for the game in 2020 versus the predicted score for the game in 2020. So it finds that for every single game, for every single team. It adds them all up and it divides it by the number of games times 2. Because we have a pair, right? We're predicting both scores for each game. And that number is 4.95. So that means that basically on average, we are within 5 points of predicting each individual score of the game. So if you want to look at this, and of course, this is a sort of naive assumption. It's actually probably a little better than this, but sort of the worst case, if the two scores were independent, which they can't possibly be, that would be a ridiculous assumption, but it's sort of the worst case scenario. They were within 10 points on the spread. In reality, it's probably a bit better than this.
Yeah, and Ed, I just want to jump in here real quick because something interesting that I really just put together right now was with this mean absolute error being about 5 points. A lot of spreads you'll see set at like the -6, +6 range. And maybe that's why our spread results were the best of the bunch in terms of the bets that we have the model predicting. That's kind of an interesting thing that I didn't really think about until now.
That could be, yeah. These numbers certainly seem to relate to the spread. Let me talk about another thing, which is the mean absolute error. We also have something called the mean squared error. So it's basically the same idea, but instead of looking at each number individually, we square that number before we add it up. And this is about 40. It's 38.92. So again, this is a squared number, so it's a little hard to interpret. You can sort of think about taking the square root of it. But the square root of that number, roughly around 40, is clearly bigger than 4. And so what this suggests then is it suggests that our model is wrong on sort of a small handful of games where it's rather wrong, where most of the time with the mean absolute error, which tells you more about sort of the general trend, it's pretty close. So again, right, being very wrong on an occasional game is not necessarily a bad thing. Why? Well, because some games might have been sort of unpredictable upsets. But the fact that it does in general well on the rest of the games, I think almost seems like a bit of an advantage of it.
Awesome. And Ed, we're kind of at the end here. I want to first off thank you for joining me. One on the podcast, two in assisting creation of this model. And we have written an article on it. Is titled Data Driven Sports Betting. You can find it on Medium. I'll be sure to link it in all of our descriptions here. So Ed, if people want more from you, if people want to learn more about machine learning, any data science content, where can they find you?
So if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I'm Ed Krueger. On Medium, I'm Ed Krueger. On YouTube, it's Edward Krueger Data. And on Twitter, it's Ed Krueger. If you want a quick access to my Medium, go to edkruegerdata.com and you can follow me there. Anything I post on Medium or YouTube, I'll also post to LinkedIn and Twitter. So LinkedIn is Ed Krueger and Twitter is Ed Krueger Data.
Fantastic. And just as the side note here, our model does come out this Wednesday, and we'll be posting the model picks on our website at sleepingwiththenumbers.com, and they'll also be on Action Network at SWTN_model. Thanks so much, Ed.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. It's been great working with you on this.